I'm about ready to share with you, friends, about my first car. And I've written out in story form here. And I actually have a blurb line, which goes as follows. Some men might forget their first sweetheart, but few indeed are those who will ever forget their first car. And I've asked a lot of men about that. And almost everyone seems to remember their first car, even those of us who've had a lot of cars. And so I think this is extremely important. I don't know why, but it's important to me. And having been a car dealer for about 30 years and cars having been my hobby as well as my livelihood, I tell my wife and others that I have a good excuse for having a lot of cars, because I didn't go out and deliberately buy them for the most part. A few of them I did, but they came as a consequence of taking a trade in other cars and so on, and so that's kind of my lame excuse. But at any rate, on with the story. And at the time, as you shall see, I was actively involved in my business, and now I am retired. Perhaps you can tell that from my face that I should be retired. As the owner-manager of a small used car business, I can't help feeling sorry for today's average city kid buying his very first car. It's just not the same as when I was a kid. Of course, I wasn't a city kid either. I was a country boy, but most children are raised in the city nowadays. And incidentally, I've written from this, of course, from the perspective of a teenage kid, a boy, but I like to think that there are young ladies in the audience that can relate to this as well. In the first place, the law in most states, and probably Canada, requires that young people be 18 years old before they own a car, and at 18 you are hardly a kid. Then too, most kids today couldn't get more than 5 blocks from home without being stopped for not having a valid license on the car and a driver's license. And he probably can't get a driver's license without first taking driver's ed, and that's in high school. This means he has a qualified instructor and he learns in a specially equipped car. And I guess I'm so old I never had to do that, but I remember seeing equipped cars for students, and they have dual controls, at least enough so that the instructor could stop the thing, and take control if the need arose. But at any rate, I guess my dad was my instructor. Because of this, he loses the thrill of learning to drive in his very own first car. Well, he might learn to drive it, but not legally. Well, there goes a whole lot of fun right off the bat, so to speak. But I could go on and on like this, and you wouldn't really get the picture. What I've got to do is show you the exciting adventure I had with my very first car. So sit down there, and I'll just lean back, prop my feet up here on the desk, and tell you all about it. We'll just have to pretend that I am sitting here with my feet up on my desk. Looking back at it now, I guess I'd have to admit that it was one of the ugliest four-wheeled conveyances I have ever seen. And I have seen and own a lot of them, probably hundreds of having been a car dealer. Many, many years before I owned it, the car had evidently been an open touring car, but it had been butchered up and made into a flatbed pickup of sorts. Such a large portion of the body was gone, it was a little hard to be certain, but it probably, based on a rough guess, probably was about a 1912 to 1918 model. I never did have a title to it. Looking back on it now, I can't imagine that, but I never had a title. It was a Model T Ford, and that much was certain. There was no doubt about that. I was about 15 years old at the time, and it was at least twice that, so you see, it wasn't exactly a late model, even by the standards of those days. I like to bring this out because you might get the mistaken idea that I am so old that the car was about my vintage. But I like to tell you that I'm not quite that old. I bought the car from one of my schoolmates. He was quitting school and needed the money. At least that's what he said. I don't doubt he needed the money, all right, but some of the kids said that they were kicking him out because he was too stupid to go to school. Well, I never did believe that because he was smart enough to fleece me out of my entire life savings, $8. And that wasn't all. I had to throw in 2 Hershey bars and a chocolate shake just to show how much I appreciated his great generosity in selling it to me in the first place. I asked him if it ran, and he assured me that the guy who sold it to him said he had talked to a fellow who said that he had heard it run once. Well, that was good enough for me. A source that reliable could hardly be questioned. I didn't know how to drive a Model T Ford with its 3 complicated foot pedals, but one of my buddies assured me that he knew all about it. Incidentally, that's still interesting to me because there are a lot of people nowadays that don't know how to drive a Model T Ford. It's altogether different, you know, the standard Model T Ford from the cars of today, or even the older cars of the similar vintage to Model T with a normal clutch and so on. So it's a different deal. But at any rate, back to it. I didn't know how to drive the Model T because of those foot pedals, but one of my buddies assured me he knew all about it. I took up a collection. We bought a gallon of gas. When we poured it into the tank, we discovered it leaked like the proverbial sieve, but there was still enough going to get into the carburetor. About a dozen of us pushed the ancient machine over the brink of a long, steep hill, then piled on. And if any of you have ever been down into the Tonasket area in Washington, you might recall I forgot the highway number. Coming from Republic, there's quite a long hill going down there into the center of town, by the way. So, like I say, it's about a dozen of us jumped on the car and pushed over the brink of a long, steep hill and then piled on. Well, my experience, I have that in quotes, experienced buddies swerved wildly from one side of the road to the other. I jiggled a bunch of the loose wires up under the dash, and another engineer sat on a front fender and poked at the vibrator points of the 4 coils. And anybody in the Model Ts knows what I'm talking about. Just as we were entering the big, in quotes, big town population, about 998, about the same nowadays, I think, the engine let off with one huge, deafening explosion that sounded like a cannon. Must have rocked the town like a sonic beam, but of course that was long before anyone I've ever heard of, or much less heard, an actual sonic boom. And pieces of old muffler, rotted exhaust pipe, rust and soot flew everywhere. One poor timid kid leaped off while the car was still rolling along at a pretty good clip and took off like a turpentine cat. The rest of us hastily decided that since we were nearly to the bottom of the hill anyway, it might be wise to push it off the side of the road and disappear, just in case the town cop came out to investigate. And at that particular moment, I kind of wished the clunker belonged to someone else. And also I wasn't feeling real good, or the fact that I'd bought it without my folks' knowledge, much less their approval. I decided I would wait for a good time to tell them about it, like maybe when I got to be 21. Or perhaps I could work on it during the noon hour there at school with the help of my friends. And then when my dad's car broke down and he was in a big jam, I'd come forward like a gallant hero and offer the use of my fine automobile. Well, things never worked out quite that way. The town cop came up to the school and with very little checking around, found out who the ugly heap belonged to. In fact, I suspect that some of my classmates, bless their hearts, were eager to tattle on me, unless they were accused of owning the car. He gave me a lecture about littering the streets with such debris and asked me how I'd like him to respond to impound it and send the bill to my dad. Well, I wasn't too happy over the prospects of that idea, I can assure you. He said, okay, I'll give you about 3 days to think of a better alternative plan. And after that period of time, he assured me that he would proceed to do it his way. I tried real hard to sell it. I had a very special sale, only $4. That's half the price I gave for it, as is where he is. No luck. As time ran out, getting close to the 3-day period, I really panicked. I offered to give it free to anyone who would move it away. No takers. My buddies had all seen that auto ownership could involve certain disadvantages. And to this day, I was saying about this, I can't remember how my friend got this thing that close to the school in the first place. He didn't bother to tell me that. He probably had a buddy his tow it there. I can't remember that. But after that first little experience at selling cars, it still amazes me how I ever happened to become a car dealer. I couldn't even give one away. Well, with time running out, I had to accept the inevitable thrust of fate and break the jolly good news to my dad. Actually, as I recall, he was quite sporting about it, and it wasn't any worse than the time I accidentally dropped his best hammer down into the well. Dad brought the old 1936 Chevy pickup into town, and we towed the Model T home. For me, the thrills of that experience must have been at least as great as those to be encountered in running the Indianapolis 500. It was already early evening, and we had many chores to do when we returned home. We had 12 miles of steep, crooked, rough country roads to negotiate, and this, along with the fact that it would soon be dark, caused my dad to hurry right along, and the fact he wasn't very happy, I think, caused him to speed up a little bit too, a little more than was necessary. It was a little bit frightening back there. And the fact that the T had one front tire with no air in it did nothing to enhance its driving and riding qualities, and instantly contributed to when my friend said he knew how to drive and was coming down the hill and was swerving all over. Well, that flat tire didn't help you a bit, you can be sure of that. But incidentally, that right front corner of the car never did rate a real tire with air. For lack of funds to buy a suitable tire, even a used one, I always kept an old tire casing wired to the rim with barbed wire. And this made a rather peculiar noise as Old Faithful galloped along. Also it kicked up dirt, mud, and dust like you wouldn't believe. I named the car Old Faithful because this was the exact opposite of what it actually was. In reality, a balky old mule would have been fast, dependable transportation compared to that cussed T. I have no doubt but that the wild ride home in tow behind the straining pickup was the swiftest, least trouble-plagued trip Old Faithful ever made. That is, unless some other previous owner had also towed it somewhere, which, by the way, thinking about it, was probably quite likely. The road home was all uphill, so I didn't have to worry about coasting up into the rear end of the pickup. But I prayed real hard that Dad would have no reason to make a fast stop. Excuse me. I knew that the brakes were so poor I'd be better off dragging one foot rather than wasting it on the brake pedal. And had I known then about Old Faithful's frightening habit of jackknifing and suddenly going into a full right turn, I would have expired of a heart attack on that fast ride home. So today I'm sure it must have been a miracle that it didn't happen, and I'm serious about that. By the way, I'll just throw this in for those of you who don't know Model Ts. Most of them originally didn't have brakes that worked on the rear wheels or even the front wheels. There were no brake drums there. Well, there was a brake drum, but it was just for emergency brake. But the actual braking was you applied the brake pedal, and there was a band in the transmission that stopped the drive line going back to and from the rear wheels. That was the brake. And so without that, you had no brakes, basically. After it was safely home, my very thought during my waking hours was of how to get it running. Another thought. I throw it in. We have leisure time, friends. But, Then they came up with a Warford transmission and the Ruxel rear axle, which is a great addition. And I had a Model T with a Ruxel rear axle, and a lot of Model T experts know this. There's a possibility with the original Ruxel, which is a two-speed rear end, of getting it so that it was out of gear. And so you had no brakes at all. So the Ruxel was great for going up hills and so on, but you need to be careful because you've got it out of gear. You have no brakes, and once it's rolling, you can't get it back in because the gears are straight gears, you know, they're not beveled at all. But at any rate, I just throw that in for what it's worth. After the Model T was safely home, my every thought during my waking hours was of how to get it running. I worked on it any time I could sneak away from whatever I was supposed to be doing for Dad, plus half the time I should have been sleeping. I figured out that the big explosion we got out of it in town occurred because the spark arrived at the wrong cylinder at the right time or something like that. The big trouble was that so many wires were disconnected under the dash and elsewhere on the coil box, I didn't know where they were supposed to go. My lucky break came when I out-ate my dad one day during the lunch period. Sometimes, if I could eat slowly enough, Dad would relax in his easy chair while he waited for me to finish so we could go back out to work. If I was real lucky, occasionally he would go to sleep, and I would then tippy-toe quietly outside and work on the old Model T until he woke up. Well, on this particular day, not only did Dad go to sleep, but while he was asleep, old Callie rode up on his ornery black stallion. And Callie saw me out working on the T and came over to say hello. And incidentally, it's quite interesting that there were at least 3 old bachelors up there in that country that really, I could write about a book, some of them, but old Callie was one of them. At any rate, he rides up on his old black stallion and says hello. He says, I see you got yourself one of them blanky blank old T's. And of course, it wasn't blanky blank. He filled in the blanky blanks in a very positive manner. I was proud to have him talk to me just like I was a real grown-up man. I answered back real loud the way he talked because he was hard of hearing, and I'm hard of hearing now, too. Well, you got one of them blanky blank T's, huh? Yeah, I sure do. And she's giving me a bad time. Do you know anything about him? He rolled his cut around his mouth and spat a big stream of yellow tobacco juice smack on the left rear tire from about 6 paces. Son, I don't know nothing about any automobile, and I know a lot less about a blankety-blank Ford. Well, Dad came around the corner of the house just then, having been awakened by the dog barking and Callie's loud, expressive talking, and mine as well. Howdy, Callie. Howdy do there, Clarence. I saw my big chance and zeroed in. I kind of knew my dad. Hey, Dad, do you think you could figure out where this wire goes? This and then a few more. Dad had already told me he didn't know anything about it. Never owned a T in his life. Well, I knew he wasn't about to admit it in front of old Callie. Well, son, let's have a look. We ought to be able to figure it out somehow. Of course, old Callie, suddenly he just couldn't stand to be a complete novice, so first thing you know, he had suddenly become somewhat of an expert. What a change in the last few minutes. I just stood there and watched the 2 technicians as they worked. And Callie talked the loudest, but did the least. Yes, sirree, I cut my teeth working on these blank T's. Never seen one yet I couldn't fix in the dark with my eyes shut and my hands tied behind my back. His dialogue also consists of a lot of words you just don't print. He had the dubious honor of possessing the most colorful vocabulary on the mountain. Rough, uncouth mothers hurried all children up the age of about 15 into the house if they chanced to see old Callie approaching. If he came into the house, which was seldom, all the kids were sent out to do the evening chores no matter what the time of day. Also, he took great pride in his reputation of being the worst driver in the whole country. He knew only 2 speeds, stopped and wide open. And I remember I was going along with Dad one day, and old Callie was in the pickup with us, and Callie says, "I wish I could drive like this." I thought, "What's he talking about? Dad's just driving down the road. There's nothing unusual about it." And Dad, "What do you mean, drive like this?" And Callie admitted that all he knew how to drive was really fast, either really fast or not at all. But anyway, I interrupted us. He knew only two speeds, stopped and wide open. One thing was in his favor, however. He wasn't considered a real danger to any other drivers. And there weren't very many anyway up there in the mountains. Anytime his keen eyes caught sight of another car on the narrow country road, he simply ran off the road. Didn't make any difference if there were trees, brush, cliffs, or lakes. Callie just darted off the road. This practice was, as you might imagine, somewhat hard on cars. Consequently, he rode his big stallion most of the time. And I have to remember a spot right on the Wingo Hill, which is tremendously steep. He could have killed himself in certain places, where he did just what I said. He ran his car off in the chokecherry bushes and the trees, and it took about 2 teams of horses to pull that car out. And he kind of laughed about it. But like I said, it was kind of hard on cars. And I'm quite certain neither Dad nor Callie alone could have solved that wiring problem, although I'm fairly certain that Callie's technical advice wasn't worth a hill of beans, as the old saying goes in cowboy country. Well, just that his presence there made my dad refuse to admit defeat. So it wasn't too long before all the coils were merrily buzzing away and in the correct order beside. Having accomplished the impossible, they were both heroes in my sight. Later, I wired a gallon can up on the windshield frame, ran a hose down to the carburetor, and the leaky gas tank problem was solved. And this also eliminated the exasperating peculiarity shared by most early Model Ts, that of running out of gas when attempting to climb hills, since the original gas tank mounted under the seat was placed too low to provide sufficient gravity flow of gas to the carburetor. And I'll explain in the later years, probably, I've forgotten the exact year, probably started about 1924, 25, Henry Ford wised up on that, and he put the gas tank up under the cowl. That's why just in front of the windshield there was a little door and to fill the gas tank there. Yeah, but this is a side path. That a lot of Model Ts in the early days, the people would back up the hill, and a lot of people think it was because it had a lower ratio in reverse than it did low. But no, it wasn't. That wasn't really the case. It was because the same basic ratio, but couldn't get any gas when you're going uphill. But with the gas tank under the seat, but so you turn around and backed up. Well, then the gas is running down instead of trying to run up. Fairly obvious deal. But at any rate, back to the story. It was at this juncture that Dad tried to bring me back down to earth by reminding me that if by some quirk of fate I was able to get the engine started, I didn't know how to drive the car. I was sobered but not discouraged. In discussing my problem with a friend, I discovered that his family owned an ancient automobile manual that told in careful detail all about the mysterious art of driving a Model T Ford with its 3 confusing foot pedals. They kindly loaned me the book, and I sat in the car for hours reading the instructions over and over, memorizing them until I felt confident that I could solo with no trouble. And I believe I had almost as much fun sitting in the car reading that book as I did later trying to drive that cussed T. Well, since I was now quite certain I was an expert Model T driver, I once again took up the strenuous task of cranking. I worked as I never had before in all my life. If Dad had made me work that hard on one of his projects, I'd have yelled to high heaven. And I used a little bit of author hyperbole there because my dad was not the kind of guy that would have taken me yelling to high heaven, to tell you the truth. But I put it in anyway to get the point across. I choked the engine, primed it, and cranked some more. I panted and puffed and rested and then did it all over again. I got mad and kicked the tires and pounded the fenders with my fists. Then, as though it had just been waiting for me to reach a certain degree of frustration, the cantankerous engine coughed, wheezed, backfired, then roared to life. I still remember the happiness of that moment. I motioned to my little brother, who was sitting in the car, all duly instructed for this moment, if it should occur, to be ready to pull the spark lever down, which he did. And this advanced the ignition time, and the engine smoothed out and speeded up. Sounded pretty good. To say that I was excited and elated would be a great understatement. I can best describe my feelings by confessing that I never felt quite like that again until my wedding day. My wife doesn't particularly like that line. My little brother Gary opened the gate, that then came and got back in the car beside me. I pushed the hand clutch lever forward and mashed down hard on the low-speed pedal. The car leached forward, and we swept grandly down the hill in a huge cloud of dust and blue oil smoke. I aimed for the narrow gateway and plunged through it, missing the gate post by the slightest fraction of an inch. My mom was sitting on the doorstep, her hands over her face. But she's still too curious, I guess. Hands over her face and her eyes almost protruding from the sockets as they stared wildly out from between her fingers. It's quite certain I can describe how the Wright brothers felt on their first flight. They must have had much the same feeling I had as I drove Old Faithful under her own power on that unforgettable day so long ago. I had entered a new, exciting, though often exasperating period of my life. From that day to the present, for good and for bad, my life has been greatly influenced by that awesome contraption, the automobile. I soon discovered that my little brother, who was about 9 years old, was very attracted to the old car. He would gladly do some of my most despised chores. I kind of bribed him if I would kindly allow him to watch me start the car. To understand this, you must realize that simply starting that car could become quite a show. Even today, in these days of professional entertainers and some very humorous television programs, I'm fairly certain that a 30-minute movie of me trying to start that temperamental, stubborn car would be worth a small fortune. But unfortunately, none exists. Sometimes I'd crank until I fell exhausted to the ground, where I would lie panting and sweating while Gary rolled in the dirt and laughed until the tears rolled down his cheeks. At other times, I'd do a dance that must have made an Indian war dance look like a gentle waltz. You want to know why? Listen. I think the part Gary liked best was when the engine would kick back against the crank, and the crank would then spin backward like an airplane propeller, and it usually whacked me on the back of the hand or smacked me on the shins. And as I hopped about, just moaning in pain, I could hear Gary whooping and laughing as though he had just seen the funniest thing in the world. And when the pain had at last subsided somewhat to a dull throb, he would yell, "Do it again! Do it again!" as though I had done it on purpose. I guess the only reason I never had an arm broken was because Dad had instructed me as to how to hold the crank, so that it merely kicked back out of my hand instead of tearing my arm off. To this day, I believe Gary was praying that the car would start hard and kick like a mule. I prayed for the opposite, but evidently his faith was stronger. His prayer was usually answered long before mine. Though Gary loved to watch me start the car and almost always got his money's worth of entertainment, I more than made up for it when I got it running. There was hardly any limit to what he would do for me if only I would generously allow him to ride in the car with me. He actually was a reasonably bright kid, but I guess the fact that he spent more time pushing than riding never did register on his 9-year-old brain. The roads available for our traveling were quite limited because of the fact that they were mostly uphill or down. Old Faithful was a lot better at going down hills than at coming back up them. We could have gone down the road a long way, but we didn't dare. We were always afraid that if we went down some of the steeper hills, we couldn't get back up. And by this time, I had the distinct impression that if we got too far away from home and couldn't coax Old Faithful back up the hills, Dad would be more than happy. He would not want to hook on with the old pickup again. His gas barrel had developed a bad habit of running dry much more frequently now that Old Faithful had joined the family. And even the farm tractor seemed to run out of gas quite often for some mysterious reason. My siphon hose was well hid. We knew we couldn't count on Dad to tow us home. He'd be glad to help push the tea over a cliff, but it was highly improbable that he'd be willing to tow it home. So it was that our excursions were usually up the road rather than down. The distance we traveled from home was largely determined by how well Old Faithful was running and how strong Gary felt at the time. We'd go full throttle, sometimes attaining frightening speeds of as high as 15 to 20 miles an hour. The car never had a speedometer, but we could tell by how hard the wind blew against our big 10-gallon cowboy hats. Old Faithful seemed to be able to detect the slightest incline, would slow down at an alarming rate. When we were down to about 5 or 10 miles per hour, I'd push on the low gear pedal with all my strength. Usually it wasn't long after that until the car started to buck and jerk and wheeze. The steam and hot water would come shooting out of the little hole in the radiator cap. It took a great deal of stamina and perseverance on my part to keep my seat and not abandon ship, as all that hot water and steam made the cockpit about as comfortable as sitting in a cannibal's steaming hot pot. And this was another reason, by the way, we dubbed her Old Faithful, regularly spouting off. Shortly after the steaming and jerking began, Gary would leap out and push as I screamed for him to push harder. If we made it over the top, I'd brag about how strong he was. What a great little brother he was. But if we stalled out, I'd yell at him for being so puny and such a sissy. It's little wonder he developed much strength and stamina. He often wrestled me to the ground. While he developed all that stamina and muscle and the muscular body, as I say, I grew a powerful left leg from pushing so hard on the low pedal. I was the only kid in the country who walked around in big circles. We had very little difficulty in thinking up excuses to use the old T. We even used it to go out to the end of our lane where the mailbox was located on the county road. It was a distance equal to only about 2 or 3 city blocks, but it was an excuse to drive the car. It is here that our little sister Sherry enters the picture. She was only about 6 years old, and the car was a little too noisy and wild for her to enjoy as much as Gary and I did. There was one thing she thoroughly enjoyed, however, and that was making fools of us. If we chanced to see the mail carrier's mud-caked Studebaker pickup coming down the hill, we'd make a wild dash for the old T, and Sis would start for the mailbox on foot. Well, if she chased butterflies, picked wildflowers, threw rocks at grasshoppers, and stopped to pick and eat a few wild berries on the way out, she'd have the mail and be only about halfway back by the time we got Old Faithful cranked up and roared out of the yard. She would then poke along while we raced out to the end of the drive, negotiated a wild turn through the rocks and sagebrush, and hurtled, rhymes with turtled, down the home stretch. Sis would then gleefully goose-step the last few yards and be standing on the doorstep waving the mail and grinning her most disgusting little sis grin as we steamed into the yard.
Stop. We've lost our sound. I don't know why. This thing died on us here.
Is that?
Let's try this again here.
Well, no, the red light is still on.
That's weird. I think it would be good to go back a little ways.
Yeah, you probably don't know where
I don't know exactly where it stopped. wow. Oh, brother. Huh.
This cussed tea is going to be more cussed than ever.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Go ahead. Start back a couple of paragraphs, maybe.
Let me see. I could go back to the difficulty. We didn't have much difficulty thinking of ways to use it. But that's going to take a lot of editing on your part to splice it in there.
Okay. That's all right. It's not a problem.
Is that right?
Yeah, that's fine.
Is it working now? Can you tell if it's working? Testing one.
Yeah, it's working now.
It's working now.
Yeah, it's working now.
Okay, I'll go back to where we're. Let me see. Yeah, about to where we. Excuses for using it.
Yeah, go ahead.
We have very little difficulty in thinking of excuses to use the old T. We even used it to go out to the end of our lane where the mailbox was located on the county road. Was a distance equal to about 2 or 3 city blocks, but it was an excuse to drive the car. It is here that our little sister Sherry enters the picture. She was only about 6 years old, and the car was a little too noisy and wild for her to enjoy as much as Gary and I did. But there was one thing she thoroughly enjoyed, and that was making fools of us. If we chanced to see the mail carrier's mud cake Studebaker pickup coming down the hill, we'd make a wild dash for the T, and she would start for the mailbox on foot. If she chased butterflies, picked wildflowers, threw rocks at grasshoppers, and stopped to pick and eat a few wild berries on the way out, she'd have the mail and be only about halfway back by the time we got Old Faithful cranked up and roared out of the yard. She would then poke along while we raced out to the end of the drive, negotiate a wild turn out to the rocks and sagebrush, and hurtled, rhymes with turtled, down the home stretch. Sis would then gleefully goose-step the last few yards and be standing on the doorstep waving the mail and grinning her most disgusting little sis grin as we steamed back into the yard. It was awfully disconcerting, as the only excuse we could think of for using the car to get the mail was that it was faster. After losing a particularly embarrassing mail race, Mom made it even more embarrassing by asking, "Faster than what? Faster than crawling?" One mail race stands out above all the rest in my memory. We were really moving out on the home stretch and gaining on Sis when suddenly the front wheels jackknifed, nearly breaking my wrist as the steering wheel spun violently to the right. We plowed full speed into a massive chokecherry bush and ended up off the ground. Old Faithful was tilting at an alarming angle, with the engine bellowing as the rear wheel spun futilely 2 feet up in the air. I was dumped unceremoniously out into the deep dust of the road, and then got a good mouthful of dust when Gary plopped out right on my head. After we realized we weren't dead, we rolled in the dirt and laughed until our sides hurt. Luckily, Dad wasn't home, so we sneaked the crawler tractor out and pulled the car out of the bushes and spent the next few hours driving up and down to blot out the tractor tracks in the road. We were afraid that if Dad realized just how dangerous Old Faithful could be, he might clip our wings. Another chore we devised as an excuse for using the old T was that of hauling wood. Dad already had the woodshed stacked high with huge piles of wood ready for the chopping, but we insisted that it was too hard to split, or too green, or too wet, or too dry, etc., etc. And we took Old Faithful out on some pretty wild hair-raising forays out to the dinghies in search of old snags and poles to use for firewood. The pastures were thick with suitable material, but we were very discriminating and discovered that the best wood was to be found far from home. We also found that often the truly prized wood was obtained from dead trees still standing. We didn't just simply saw them down either. No, indeed, that would not have been sportsmanlike. Instead, we yanked them out by the roots. I've already pointed out that Old Faithful was quite short of power, barely having enough to pull the hat off your head, so to speak. Well, we hit upon a very ingenious and simple plan to overcome this problem. We combined speed and weight with the little power available and performed wondrous feats of engineering. Somewhere we found a big, long, rusty cable which had long before been abandoned by some loggers. We would tie one end high up in the tree, then hitch the other end to Old Faithful's hinder parts. Taking off with the engine roaring under full throttle, we'd hit the end of the cable with a terrific, neck-snapping, spine-tingling jolt. If the stubborn tree still refused to let go of Mother Earth's bosom, we'd use a little more slack in the cable, thus allowing a higher speed and the resultingly harder jolt when Old Faithful came to the end of her leash. Many times the rear of the car was yanked clear off the ground, and the back tires would claw desperately trying to get traction in mid-air. I don't know why the ancient frame wasn't jerked right out from under the remains of the T's rusty body. These wood-gathering forays usually called for climbing some rather steep hills on old logging roads. Consequently, Gary's pushing was indispensable. I vividly recall one such incident, as does my brother Gary. The old car was jerking and wheezing when Gary jumped off to give the much-needed assist. Unfortunately, he jumped off on the uphill side onto a steep, slippery roadside bank. He lost his footing and fell down, his legs sliding in under the car, just in time to be run over by the rear tire. Fortunately, it had air. I heard his pain-filled yell at the precise moment Old Faithful ran out of soup. In the excitement and pressure of the moment, I missed the brake pedal and promptly proceeded to let the car right back over him again, in real hit-em-while-they're-down fashion. Luckily, no permanent damage was done, although it did put a crimp on our travels for a time, as Gary was very reluctant about jumping out of the car to push after that little incident. I say out of the car, more realistically off the car, because it didn't have that in its body. Well, how well I remember the day I took the neighbor lady home, neighbor girl. She had walked the mile or so up to our place on an errand, and I gallantly offered to drive her home. She was 2 or 3 years younger than I was, so naturally I wanted to impress her with my automobile and my great driving skill. As we neared her house, the brand new gate her dad had just finished building loomed proudly into view. And perhaps I could pause to tell you that he was kind of known as Peter Tumbledown. And he had considerable pride in what he had done in building this new gate. So it was not a little thing. It was known in the neighborhood in a sense. But at any rate, I interrupted me. As we neared her house, the brand new gate her dad had just finished building loomed proudly into view. Thinking to merely give her a little scare, I headed straight for it, fully intending to jerk to a halt just a few inches from it. "Watch me drive through your old man's gate," I shouted as I built up the suspense for my big joke. Unfortunately, however, when the old T was about 6 feet away from the gate, I panicked. Instead of pushing the low pedal halfway down, which is the clutch, I automatically mashed down harder, which threw the transmission into low gear. with an awful splintering crash and with boards, poles, wire, and headlamps flying in all directions, we plowed through the gate. About 10 feet through the gate, I finally brought Old Faithful to a very much belated halt. We sat there in painful silence for several minutes before Louise caught her breath and croaked, "Wow, Kenny, I never dreamed you'd really do it. I just thought you were kidding." We spent hours rebuilding that gate, and it was never the same, and several yards of fence besides. All the while we worked, I tried to assure her that it really had been just an accident, that I had intended to just give her a thrill. I'm not certain I ever convinced her, and I understand that to this day, nearly 30 years later, her dad still refers to me as that smart aleck neighbor kid. I'm happy to relate to you that after that, and many apologies and a little bit of homework and so on that home, I was forgiven and we ended up pretty good friends. In this narrative, I've shared only a few of the most memorable experiences I had with my first car. There were many other incidents as well, but if I told them all in detail, I'm afraid I'd have to write a book. I need to tell of the hours I spent on my back underneath that cussed tea, as dirty engine oil dripped into my eyes, my mouth, and my hair, then trickled down my arms into my armpits. I'd have to elaborate on how I discovered that dried horse manure made a pretty fair radiator stop leak, but became a most disgusting facial treatment when the radiator erupts. I would have to tell of how that we were the originators of refueling on the go, as Brother Gary slopped gas from a glass jug into Old Faithful's wildly swaying 1 gallon tin gas tank wired high up on the windshield frame. He also slopped gas all over everything else, including himself, the driver, and any passengers. The fact that we weren't cremated, since the coils were all merely shooting sparks only inches away from the fueling activity, proves to me the accuracy of an old adage you may have heard. It goes something like this: God looks out for everyone, and especially for fools and children. And the fact that we were both evidently gave us double coverage. And perhaps I should add to this that the car never had a hood, so all this stuff is out in the open, the coil box and everything else. Now at this point I would like to make my humble contribution to ecology, the environment, the gasoline shortage, if there is one, the physical fitness of our citizens, and the general all-around well-being of our nations. I propose that we gradually recycle all of our present modern Detroit iron automobiles and build a huge fleet of Model Ts. Think of the benefits which will be ours as a result. There will be less smog, since only about 1/3 of the cars will be in operating condition at any one time. There will be fewer highway deaths, as most of the cars will be incapable of reaching speeds fast enough to hurt anybody or anything in the event of an accident. The government will, of course, require that all cars be equipped with tires capable of holding air, and that the same be mounted on all 4 corners of the cars. Also, it shall be mandatory that all Model Ts have anti-jackknifing devices properly installed. Much less gas and oil will be needed to operate the nation's automobiles, since Ts get pretty good gas mileage, and so few will be operable most of the time. This will leave more gas and oil to conduct wars. Naturally, the physical well-being of our citizens will become greatly improved, as we are forced to exercise by pushing cars up hills, jogging to service stations for gas. Few Ts have gas gauges, and of course there will be the ultimate exercise, that of cranking the engines. Doctors need not be alarmed or fear that they will not have sufficient patients, as the health of our people improves. There will be a terrific upsurge in broken arms caused by cranking. I also fear there may be many broken feet and lacerated knuckles, as the less patient motorists lose their tempers and resort to kicking and hitting their cars. I must in all honesty admit to one small concern. It is quite possible, in fact, more than likely, that we may experience a vast nationwide epidemic of mental disorders until the people become familiar with and capable of solving the many frustrations which can arise while driving Model T Fords. I feel, however, that the whole transition will be well worth it all, as those who become mentally ill will at least be physically healthy. And as it now stands, most of us are puny as well as goofy. But alas, time marches on, and I must conclude my story. Time brings us changes. Time brings us changes and usually improvements as well. I was able to obtain another, much better Model T Ford. This one had the Warford transmission and was actually capable of climbing nearly any hill I wished it to. I no longer had any real reason to keep Old Faithful, so when a friend offered to trade me 2 guns for the old relic, I accepted, and I still have one of those guns, a shotgun. I remember all too well that evening he came to take delivery. Snow and cold weather had arrived rather early in the Northwest that year, and because of the cold, I could naturally have expected about an hour or so of hard cranking, tire kicking, and fender pounding before Old Faithful's stubborn engine decided to start. For some unexplainable reason, that last night it was different. Old Faithful fired right off on about the 4th revolution of the crank. The engine quickly smoothed out and purred like a contented kitten. Over his position behind the steering wheel, friend Jim threw a quick wave of farewell, pressed down hard on the low pedal, and Old Faithful for the final time lurched forward and out through our gateway. I watched him all the way out the lane, past the mailbox, and out on the country road. I continued to stand there, even after Old Faithful had disappeared around the corner, dragging a billowing white cloud of snow dust behind, and I imagine I can still see it. I stood there listening to the music of the old engine crackling out in the crisp, cold, early winter air. I don't know how long I stood there, wrapped in the warm cloak of pleasant memories of time I had shared with my very first car. I realized none of the recalled none of the disgusting, painful experiences, only those which had been fun and pleasant. At last I was aware that my dog was beside me, whimpering and licking my hand, seeming to sense that something was different, something had changed, something was wrong. I knelt down and hugged him, burying my face in his soft, warm fur as I had done when I was much younger, much smaller. I found it pleasant and comforting, the same as I had found it long before. I turned then to go back into the house, and as I did so, the shiny, fresh black paint of my new, in quotes, my new 1927 T gleaming in the soft light spilled out through the window of the house. This also helped a little, but not enough. As I shuffled somewhat dejectedly into the house, little brother's keen eyes studied my face. "What's the matter with you? You look like you've been bawling," he piped. As I stumbled toward the ladder leading to my private domain in the dusty attic, I flung my response back over my shoulder. "I haven't either. A gnat just flew into my eye." And almost as I said it, I realized the last gnat had been frosted weeks before. I learned a poignant lesson that night. I was very aware that progress is almost inevitable, but sometimes it hurts. Sitting here now in the pleasant glow of all these warmed over memories, it seems I can imagine I hear the sweet music from Old Faithful's rusty, unmuffled exhaust pipe. If some ghost rider from the past could come driving her in right now, I'd gladly give my entire life savings, all $23.97 of it, to buy that cussed old tea back again. But we can't go back, And at this moment, a new revelation of life dawns heavily upon me, and it is this: growing older can at times be unpleasant, not simply because of getting old, but because of the things, the good times, and the good people one must leave behind in doing so. And to top it all off, a gnat just flew into my eyes, and I haven't even got a dog. The end.